Oops, he did it again. Rudy Giuliani is Pigpen from Charlie Brown, traveling in a swirl of dust and dirt that he constantly kicks up around questions about the president and his legal liabilities. First, it was the hush money scheme that Rudy let slip out. Now it's Donald Trump's discussions about Trump Tower Moscow. Giuliani on day 3 of his cleanup tour today, telling the New Yorker, quote, "I am afraid it will be on my gravestone. Rudy Giuliani, he lied for Trump." Just might be. Giuliani's still working to undo the damage from his revelation Sunday that Donald Trump's talks about building Trump Tower Moscow went on through Election Day. He trotted out a new line in that New Yorker interview entitled, "Even if he did do it, it wouldn't be a crime." We knew we'd get here. The president's own attorney saying not that Trump didn't publicly lie for months about his relationship with Russia, but that even if he did, so what? It isn't a crime. I'm guessing the pardon defense will come next. Rudy is in hot water today, though, in the West Wing for his erratic performances over the last 72 hours on television. New York Times reports, quote, "Several people close to Mr. Trump have grown exasperated with Mr. Giuliani's public appearances. They also express concern that he is increasing prosecutors' anger with the president and potentially creating a misimpression about the Trump Tower Project Moscow." The president's son resorted to the low-level coffee boy defense. You may remember that from the George Papadopoulos and Paul Manafort smear campaigns after they were indicted. Junior saying, Cohen wasn't our deal guy.
The reality is this wasn't a deal. You know, we don't know the developer. We don't know the site. We don't know anything about it. Ultimately, it was Michael Cohen essentially trying to get a deal done. You know, he was there for a long time. He wasn't exactly a deal guy. Didn't bring too many to the table, so I don't think anyone took it all that seriously. That's the reality of what went on.
But he was your deal guy. Joining our conversation, Tim O'Brien, Bloomberg Opinion Executive Editor. Peter Baker, some great reporting, I think, for your colleague Maggie Haberman there about a few people being exasperated. I want to know why there are only a few.
Well, it's a great question in that sense. I mean, I think Rudy Giuliani was not picked to be the lawyer in the grand jury room or to negotiate with the special counsel. He was picked to be the public face. Well, but here's the thing. You picked him to be the public face of the president, to be out there and pushing against the special counsel. He's succeeded to some extent in pounding away at the special counsel's conduct and reassuring the base that the president hasn't done anything wrong. But his statements at times have been so all over the map, as you see in this, what you've just shown, that it's caused great exasperation on the part of people who are trying to defend the president inside his team. They worry that this is only making things worse, not better.
Tim, they're right. It's making things worse, not better. I think what they benefit from, though, is that we cover this like Etch-a-Sketch. So we don't always lay down the marker of just how much this deviates from the original story. But the original story is, I have no business in Russia. I never sought any business in Russia. I am not seeking business in Russia. All bald-faced lies, all of them. Those were all lies told over and over again by the president, while at that time, whether Donald Trump Jr. thinks that he was a good deal guy or a bad guy, Michael Cohen was their deal guy, and he was pursuing a deal and briefing the family 10 times, I believe, about Trump Tower Moscow.
While during the campaign, the president was saying that he thought he might weaken NATO. If he came into office, he was saying he might lift sanctions on Russia if he came into office. And Rudy's extended this timeline into all of those, into the same period when Trump was saying those things. So he's created a host of new problems for Trump. You know, Rudy hasn't been, unhinged lately. He's been unhinged almost the entire time he's been a spokesman for Trump. And he was a weird public presence for years prior. I mean, this is the same guy who told his wife he was going to divorce her in a press conference. He's the same guy that gave one of the most over-the-top convention speeches during the Republican convention in 2016. And whether he's serving as Trump's lawyer or whether he's serving as a spokesman, he has to be deeply familiar with the fact pattern and the chronology and what Trump does and doesn't know. And he has blown this repeatedly. He's the one that said Michael Cohen's tapes would exonerate the president. That was incredibly wrong. He's the guy who's flip-flopped back and forth about whether or not there was collusion between the Trump campaign and the Kremlin. And now you have him dissembling about the Trump-Moscow Tower deal. When Donald Trump Jr. goes on TV and said this was just, lightweight antics, essentially, and Michael Cohen wasn't our deal guy, Michael Cohen was engaged with Felix Sater on negotiations for this. Felix Sater had an office in Trump Tower, 2 floors beneath beneath the president. He routinely debriefed Ivanka and Donald on all the deals that Trump was doing with Bayrock and in Russia. So this wasn't just a lighthearted thing. The Trump organization was deeply involved in this transaction.
I think Ivanka actually suggested the name of a star architect for the project at one point. So
it's a family operation.
Family operation.
Jeremy Bash, I want to ask you something, because it's not just Donald Jr. was disparaging Michael Cohen as a deal maker, and I've got no opinion on that. But what we know is that, like Mike Flynn, like Jeff Sessions, like George Papadopoulos, he lied about his conversations about doing business. It's not that they took place. It's not that they briefed the family. It's not that they were negotiating a real estate deal throughout the presidential campaign. And if you believe Rudy, never know if we should or shouldn't, through Election Day, it's that he lied about it. What is all the lying about? And why is this lie something that Rudy Giuliani is now on his third day of trying to shove back into the toothpaste tube?
Yeah, and I think this frame that you see being advanced by Donald Jr. in that interview, and also by Rudy Giuliani, which is there's nothing to see here. And oh, by the way, even if you're looking at it, it's not illegal. Kind of puts the entire frame upside down, because this is both a national security investigation and a criminal investigation. And in some ways, for my money, Nicole, the national security investigation is far more important. That really goes to the heart of our national interests. And when you have an adversary nation having financial leverage and potentially political leverage over a potential president of the United States, nothing could be more important. And so the fact whether or not a crime was committed by the president negotiating Trump Tower, Moscow, up until he was elected, that's besides the point. To do so is unpatriotic. To do so is shameful. To do so is downright dangerous. And for some reason, Rudy Giuliani, Don Jr., and all the apologists around the president don't seem to get that.
Frank Figliuzzi, I want to read you something else Rudy Giuliani said in that New Yorker interview out today. He said, this is Rudy, because I have been through all the tapes, I have been through all the texts, I have been through all the emails, and I knew none existed. Reporter, wait, what tapes have you gone through? Rudy? I shouldn't have said tapes. Frank?
He shouldn't say anything at this point. So he's gone through things that don't exist. He is really the worst enemy of the president. And we're in an upside down world, Nicole, where the prosecutor in the case, the special counsel, issues a press release to say that an allegation of crime against the president is not accurate from BuzzFeed. And the president's defense counsel goes on television to incriminate his client. So that's the world we're living in. I keep coming back to what's already been said is, why all the lying about Russia? And Nicole, I am left now with only one conclusion, that the news on Russia, the truth about Russia, is so bad that no one can afford to let it leak out. We have too many people covering up the same thing over and over again. And the only conclusion I have is that it's about as bad as it can be.
So what would that be? Let me just press you. And would that be a bribe? Would that be sanctions relief in exchange for a plot of land that Don Jr. said, oh, we don't even have a plot of land. We don't even have a developer. It doesn't mean it wasn't promised. What could it be?
No, I think it's worse than that. Listen, I'm developing a real sense here that there is now knowledge within the Trump circle that the Russians did assist with, in a successful way, the winning of the presidency. I am increasingly convinced that this is what people are trying to cover.
Frank, you can't leave me there. Tell me what is pointing you in that direction.
So, if we look at, I'm particularly focused on Paul Manafort, right, and his incredible reticence and reluctance to fully cooperate. Mike Flynn and the judge saying, you're not there yet, I'm not ready to accept to handle sentencing yet. The Trump family members, Cohen saying they're getting briefed. The polling data going from Manafort to Russia. All of this points to knowledge in my mind that the Russians it was understood that the Russians were assisting the campaign, and that they did so in such a way. Remember, we have over 24 Russians indicted already between hacking and social media propaganda in support of the campaign. We have Vladimir Putin saying in Helsinki to a reporter's question, did you tell your government to put their full force and support behind candidate Trump? Answer, yes. I believe there's knowledge of that. I believe there's great fear about the extent to which they assisted. And I think that's at the root of what people are lying about.
Jeremy Bash, our viewers can't see your face, but I can. Let me know what you're thinking.
I just think it's important to remember that the person who set up the Trump Tower New York meeting were the Alagarovs, Amin and Aris Alagarov. They were the principal business conduits for the Trump organization to create the Trump Moscow Tower project. So when they reached out in June 2016 and said, we want to come talk about the Russian government's assistance to your campaign, and the conversation ended up being about adoptions, which we all now know is a cover word for sanctions relief, that's the direct tie between the quid pro quo. We're going to do a financial deal for you, and you're going to give us sanctions relief. The one thing Putin wanted was sanctions relief. The one thing Donald Trump wanted was to make money and leverage and monetize his presidential campaign.
Dots are getting closer and closer to each other.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.